I kind of discovered that there is an assumption in the funeral sector that what is on your birth certificate is what goes on your death certificate. And this is not true. Like this shouldn't happen if you're a trans person. I mean, this is a massive public health concern and it should be on the agenda, but also for like the wider community and people who we could be supporting and we could be doing advocacy for and we could have better services for, but they just aren't there because we're not recording this data. We need to speak up and we need to change things.
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, mental health and kink, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. Come with us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I identify as a cisgender woman and my pronouns are she and her. In this episode, I have a conversation with YAS NECATI, a journalist and writer based in London. Yaz's pronouns are they, them, and they identify as non-binary. Find out what that means to Yaz in this episode. We also talk about detaching activities from gender, pre-colonial gender identities, the importance of writing a will and letter of wishes, why it is essential for public health policy to accurately record trans and non-binary gender identities on death certificates, which is currently not possible, and what we can do to respect and honour a person's gender identity after they have passed away. Please be aware that, as well as death, there is mention of suicide in this episode. It was recorded on the 24th of February 2021. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
My name is Yaz.
And how do you identify, Yaz?
Identify as non-binary, using they, them pronouns.
Cool. And what does being non-binary mean to you?
Oh, wow. So many things. Such a deep question. It's a really difficult one to answer. I guess it means, firstly, that I don't sit within the gender binary. I have never felt like a girl and I've never felt like a boy. I guess I kind of exist outside of those two things and none of them feels quite right. But it also means more than that. Like, it isn't just an absence of something. It's also creating a space for myself to carve out how I really want to express my gender. And I guess we're not really taught to do that. We're kind of taught like, you know, if you have these genitals, you're this, and if you have these, you're this. And that's kind of the end of the conversation. And then all the stereotypes and assumptions that come with, you know, what you're supposed to be. And being non-binary is kind of removing myself from that and being like, actually, like, what do I actually want? Like, what does my gender actually mean for me? What are the ways I'm expressing myself, telling other people? And actually, it doesn't matter what they tell other people. It's about like what I want and getting to the core of those things. And I think that's like a lifelong process. Like, it's definitely something that, like, when I was younger, I was always like, gotta be as mask as possible because, like, I don't want people to call me a girl because that's like the most likely thing that people would misgender me as when I was growing up as a girl, right? So I tried to reject femininity to get closer to being perceived how I wanted to be perceived. But then as I got older and I started doing drag, actually, I began to get a little bit more comfy with my feminine side. And I'm still working on it, but I guess it's about trying to find this place where I'm not basing how I look or how I dress or whatever on how other people react to me and my gender, but thinking about, actually, what do I really want? Like, maybe I want to paint my nails and that's okay. Like, I don't have to associate that with femininity. Why is that a feminine thing? Like, why does society say that that's feminine? What about it is feminine? Right. You know, it's just paint on a part of your body. Like, so trying to really detach activities from genders and just go with what I feel like feels fun and good for me.
Mm. I was just thinking actually when you said that, when you look at the animal kingdom and in birds in particular, it's actually the males who are very colourful and very, you know, yeah. Whereas the females are more, I guess, subdued in colour. Whereas in for humans, it seems to be the other way around. It's the women who, use makeup and do their nails and stuff. And yeah, like you're saying, why does it have to be gendered? Anyone can do that. Anyone can express themselves like that, ideally without getting any grief for it. But there you go.
Mm.
Yeah. So do you feel like when you were growing up, you said you were kind of trying to reject femininity? Did you think maybe you were a trans man? Did you think you were more, leaning towards the masculine side of things? Or was that also always for you, like, no, that this doesn't fit, but that doesn't fit either?
Yeah, I think I've always been trans masculine, but I don't think I've ever thought that I was a man.
Hmm.
I definitely I remember I have, again, it's really hard to
Hmm.
reflect back on how you felt as a kid because it's really hard to pinpoint it and you're looking at it from the perspective of where you are now, like with hindsight
Right.
and trying to pick things out, right?
Yeah,
But I
totally.
do, yeah, it's funny, isn't it? But I do remember when I was maybe about 11 or 12 years old. And one of my friends at school was like, "Oh, if you could have been born a boy, would you have preferred to be born a boy?" And I said, yes.
Mm.
And so it's quite interesting because that's definitely not how I feel now.
Mm.
I definitely prefer that I was assigned female at birth because I think I associate more with womanhood, but
Mm.
than manhood, but more with masculinity than femininity. So it's a weird one. Um,
Ah, interesting.
but
That is,
but
yeah.
yeah, like most of my friends are women, and I guess I don't have. I mean, this is partly because I used to be a domestic abuse worker and also coordinate a sexual abuse helpline. So I don't have much faith in a lot of men. And that's not because of individual people, that's just because of the ideals of masculinity that people are, that like a
Mm.
lot of men, I think, especially cis men, are kind of really tied up in. And the ways that I see it become very overt and dominating and overpowering and really impact on women and non-binary people and really hurt women and non-binary people.
Mm.
But that's kind of going off topic. But I guess the reason I think that I said I would have rather been born a boy at that time is because I knew that I wasn't a girl, but I didn't really. I had never heard of non-binary people. I had no idea they could be a thing,
Mhm.
and so I think I was well, I associate with masculinity, so masculinity equals men because that's what society teaches us, right? And I think I also really saw the sexism that a lot of women in my family faced from, men in my family, and sexism that happened at school and just in the wider, more general world. And I hated being at the receiving end of that. So I think there was
Mm.
a slight association of being a man with just having a better life and being less discriminated against. And as I grew up and grew into myself and begin to understand more about gender and discover the term non-binary and start finding out that actually genders other than just man or woman have existed for thousands thousands and thousands of years and across cultures, and it's actually very it's a very white thing to just assume that there are only two genders and that's it.
Mm.
Yeah, as I started finding out more about that and realizing my own gender identity, I was like, yeah, I don't think I ever wanted to be born anything. Like, I was born non-binary and I just never knew it until I had the language to describe it. um
Mm.
yeah, and I don't think I'm trans to fit into any binary. I think I'm trans to be stepping outside of that.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, because is it colonialism? Is that the word? That's
Yeah.
got, yeah, because that obviously wiped out a lot of diversity when it comes to gender, doesn't it? Because it's in indigenous cultures all over the world. There's definitely
Yeah,
more than two. Yeah.
everywhere, from like lots of tribes on the African continent to two-spirit people in indigenous American culture, to the Hujra in India. Like it's everywhere. If you look in pretty much like
Mm.
most people of color historical cultures, there is so much more of a understanding of gender not being this like fixed binary that fits into two boxes, and it being something
Mm.
much bigger and more flexible than that. Even like one of my Jewish friends was saying that in the ancient Torah there are like 6 genders, so like it's something that is just like, even in, I guess, in Jewish culture now, that isn't, across most mainstream Judaism, that isn't like really talked about very much. And
Mm.
so I think like even in cultures where it has existed for a long time, we kind of assimilate to like the colonialist norm as what it is at the time we're in
Mm.
now.
Mm. Yeah. It's like we just really should question everything because normal is very relative, isn't it? Like, what is
Hmm.
normal anyway? Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very questionable, if you ask me. Yeah. So, you've written an article for the Huffington Post, which by the time this episode goes live will be out. It's not out
Hey.
yet as we record it. Are you a writer, journalist?
Yeah. So yeah, I do bits, all sorts of writing.
Yeah.
So like I like creative writing. It's like my jam, and I'm like a poet, and I really enjoy writing poetry, and I'm
Yeah.
part of a collective called London Queer Writers, where we like just write together and like
Mm.
host performance, like spoken word nights and stuff.
Oh, awesome. Brilliant.
Yeah, which is like so fun. But I also do journalism, and yeah, I wrote for the Independent for a couple of years. I was a staff writer there, but now I'm doing
Mm.
I kind of went away, did that domestic abuse, sexual abuse support work, and now I'm taking a bit of a break from frontline work and coming back to doing more freelance journalism. So that's where this
Mm.
piece sprung from.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me what it's about.
So the piece is about basically non-binary recognition after death. And it started off because there was actually an editor at the Huffington Post who was looking at death statistics for coronavirus and this kind of like demographic breakdown for those statistics, and
Mhm.
realized that there was literally like no recording of non-binary people in those statistics. And you can see this like across statistics for everything, like death statistics for anything, right? It's not
Mhm.
just like COVID. And it brought about this thought of like, well, how can we record those deaths if non-binary people can't be recognized on death certificates? So they currently can't. There's a few different bodies, like kind of governmental bodies that oversee death certificates. There's one that
Mm.
covers England and Wales, one that covers Northern Ireland, and one that covers Scotland. And I got in touch with all of them, and all of them were like, "Yeah, no, it's universal. We just have a box that says sex, and your sex can be male, female, and that's it. Like, there's no kind of, well, I mean, to get them to use the language of assigned gender at birth, I feel like
Mm.
is even more ambitious. But there's no gender identity option. So obviously, for non-binary people, this is really rough because there is no box that we can sit in. But even for binary trans people, this is really problematic. And this is something that I don't get to go into enough in the piece because it's focused on non-binary identity. But there's I guess from the people that I spoke to, I kind of discovered that there is an assumption in the funeral sector that what is on your birth certificate is what goes on your death certificate, and this is not
Mhm.
true. Like this this shouldn't happen if you're a trans person. But at the moment, like lots of, in order to record a trans person as the correct gender on their death certificate, you need to like a lot of proof. So like a gender recognition certificate or like any other kind of official documents in their chosen name and gender, which is obviously like really problematic because lots of trans people don't have that kind of
Mhm.
paperwork.
Mhm.
Or what if somebody has literally just discovered they're trans like last week and then unfortunately passed away? Like
Mm.
it's it feels quite arbitrary to focus on that paperwork and not just like
Mm.
take somebody's word that they know what gender they are when they die, you
Right?
know? Yeah. And the second thing is, even when trans people are recorded as the right gender on the death certificate, there's still no option to say that they were trans. And therefore, we're still losing like data and statistical knowledge about how many trans people have died in a certain situation. And if you look at something, I mean, this is a massive public health concern and it should be on the agenda. If you look at something like suicide, for example, we have overwhelming as evidence that shows that trans people, non-binary people are at a higher risk of ending their own lives. That there's a lot of statistics to say that a high number of trans people generally and non-binary people within that have thought about ending their lives, are thinking about it, have made attempts to end their lives. But then when you ask, well, how many trans people have ended their lives? There's literally no statistics because it can't be recorded on death certificates that people are trans. This is like hugely problematic because it impacts policy. It impacts how charities can kind of fundraise. How are you going to convince a funder to give you money for this if there are no statistics? And so, yeah, it's really, really, really not just impactful for individuals who are kind of thinking about how they're going to reflect somebody best on a death certificate when there aren't options to reflect somebody well, but also for like the wider community and people who we could be supporting and we could be doing advocacy for and we could have better services for, but they just aren't there because we're not recording this data.
Wow. Yeah. So, what do you feel needs to happen to make an improvement?
So much, everything.
Here's a list. Yeah, by all means. Yeah,
Yeah, Boris Johnson, I hope you're listening.
I'm going to send him this episode. Totally.
I think, yeah, I mean, I have no faith in Boris Johnson to care about trans people
No.
or like any of the government at the moment, to be honest.
Mm.
But yeah, that sounds kind of grim, doesn't it? But yeah.
Yeah. But then at the same time, though, interestingly, I was talking to, in the episode with Cassian, who's what's coming out, or actually in the episode with Cassian that came out a few weeks ago, I need to say, we were talking about micro actions or micro transactions. It was a bit of an interesting way of putting things. But it's like one person doing one thing, and it might be a small thing, but it can have such a big consequence, you know. And if more people do it, because people saying, oh, there's no point, it's just me, what can I do? You know, but it's kind of like voting in the end. If everyone voted, it would make such a big difference, you know. So there is stuff we can all do. So yeah, anyway, back to what can we do? What do you think we can do?
Yeah, no, like I think that's exactly right. And I think, like, speaking to that, I interviewed a really cool funeral professional and author of a queer funeral guide called Ash Hayhurst as part of the piece.
Cool.
And yeah, he's a trans man and openly talks about that in the funeral sector. And yeah, he was making some really interesting points about, like, okay, somebody's gender can't go on their death certificate at the moment if they're non-binary, and some, like, for a lot of binary trans people this is the case as well. They might get misgendered in death, but there are lots of things that we can do aside from the death certificate to affirm somebody's gender, like making sure that their funeral is, you know, they're being called the correct pronouns. Like if there are transphobic family members who want to attend the funeral, like not giving their transphobia any air and making sure that we remember that person properly and not just how somebody who wants to misgender them wants to remember them. So creating services that are kind of catered to the individual who has passed away, respecting them and their identity in its full. And yeah, I think it's also about loved ones doing what they can, doing those little things, those micro actions, and just continuing to remember that person as they were. Like, yeah, their gender might not be on paperwork, But that doesn't mean that they weren't that person, like that paperwork, that institutional thing, like piece
Mm,
of paper doesn't define somebody, their
mm,
legacy, their life, how we remember them, what they've left behind.
mm.
Yeah, and I think in a wider context, obviously, like that paperwork element does have to change. Like it needs
Yeah.
to change.
Mm,
And there's something like 13 states in the US have put a non-binary option. I think it's about that amount have put a non-binary option on death certificates now. I think there's
mm,
a lot of talk in this country about like passports and other things, which
mm,
obviously is great, but we don't like to talk about death. And so I think it would be great if, for people outside of the funeral sector to start backing those activists in the funeral sector and be like, hey, official documentation includes death certificates too. And really, I mean, for me, I think death certificates are one of the most important documents to get right because it does have that massive, massive impact on the statistics we record and also like for
mm,
people who are already grieving, struggling, like going through that absolutely horrific thing of losing somebody that they love,
mm,
to know that they don't have this extra hurdle, this extra battle of just being like, oh, well, it's going to say they're male on their death certificate, even though this is not what they are,
mm,
is just like, that's just compassionate. Like, that's just human.
mm. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, so I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot, but there are some really great people like Ash already doing that.
Mm,
And from what I hear from him, there is a real appetite in the funeral sector to understand more about non binary identity, about trans
mm,
people generally, about queer people, to make those changes and make better services for
mm.
people.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Is something like a petition, would that be a good thing to get details changed? I think you have to have a minimum of, is it like 10,000 signatures for it to get attention in Parliament or something? I don't know. What
Yeah,
do you
I
reckon?
think like I mean, I'm a fan of petitions. I worked on a couple of petitions that have worked, and I know that like that. Sorry, this is me being geeky because I've worked at and with Change.org a few times, but I know that Change.org
Yeah.
wins a petition every minute around the world. So like some people are like petitions don't work, but like petitions don't always work, but they can work, especially if you frame them really well. But
Mm,
I think that petitions work really well alongside other things. And I think for the government to change this documentation, I think it will probably take like petition and pressure in other ways, media attention,
mm,
um, people asking questions. When like people get to ask, journalists get to ask questions like to politicians and stuff, actually putting this into the public eye, asking them and them coming back and being like, I have no answer, and then them looking bad. Like, I think it's going to take a real push from lots of people. And we've seen actually that I think it was last year that the government or the Court of Appeal said that they didn't want to, basically rejected having a non-binary option on passports. So like we still have a really, really long way to go when you're getting those options rejected. And,
mm,
one of the reasons why they weren't particularly keen on it was because they thought it would be too expensive.
mm,
Because it will cost about £2 million to put non-binary options on passports, which is wild when you think about the cost of blue passports after Brexit. Literally changing our passports from red to blue is going to cost like a couple hundred £1 million.
mm. Yeah.
So they can find the money for a color change, but they can't find the money to validate people's identities.
Right.
So
Priorities. Yeah.
yeah, it's quite wild. And like, yeah, I don't know. For me, I don't personally think, like, I think it would be good to have a third gender option on passports, but I think, like, for me, I think death certificates are even more important than passports.
Yeah, it feels that way for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, then, let's get the word out and make sure these changes happen. Yes, my inner activist is coming out now. Like, let's start a petition. Let's do
Let's
all these
do
things.
it.
Let's
Let's
do all
keep
these things.
talking about it. And I definitely
Yeah.
feel that, like, after I spoke to Ash, we were like, let's stay in touch. And I definitely feel that, like,
Mm,
there are already really amazing people doing stuff within the funeral sector, like, and trying
mm,
to change it. But it takes more than that. It takes, there are people who are already always talking about death.
mm,
And it takes everybody else to start, even though it's really difficult. And this shouldn't fall on people who are like, who are in a state where they feel like they might die soon, or, you know,
mm,
anything like that, because those people are already going through so much, and they need us, or they need people who are in a place where death doesn't technically isn't imminent. I mean, it could be imminent for me, who knows, but
right?
it
Yeah.
doesn't, like, I don't have that fear right now that it might happen,
Mm,
tomorrow at any time. And I think people, we need to speak up and we need to change things. So there was Gendered Intelligence did a project with something called the Corpse Project a few years back, where they spoke to lots of trans people about death and their wishes
mm,
being respected after death.
mm,
And one of the things that come out of that was the importance of both writing a will, because, for example, this isn't the case for all trans people, but lots of trans people are kind of estranged from, or don't have very good relationships with, their immediate family. And if you
mm,
haven't written a will, what you have will immediately go to those people. And so it's
mm,
about, like, putting your chosen family into your will, and making sure that, I don't know, that special thing that you have in your life or your home, like, I mean for me, my special thing is my cats, but, like, something that's, like, really important to you, like, goes to the people that you want it to go to, and doesn't go to people who are misgendering you and don't understand you. And then the other thing is a letter of wishes. So, like, your will obviously sets out where your assets, etc., go. And for some of us, we don't have that many assets. It's just about, like, those few things that we have going to the
mm,
right people. But the letter of wishes is a place where you can say, I want my funeral to be like this.
mm,
I want these people to be prioritized in the planning of my funeral. I want this person to be the person who arranges it, so that you can have a lot more control. And to do that now, outside of a time where you're worried about death, is a really
yeah.
good thing, because it takes that pressure off of you when you're in that place, which is already really
Mm,
difficult.
totally. Yeah. So, about this letter of wishes, is that something that you can? Because obviously, a will would involve some legal, stuff and potentially costs as well. So, a letter of wishes, is that something? Is that just something you can write down on a piece of paper? How does that work? What would people have to do?
Yeah, that's not a legal document, but you can just keep it alongside of your will. And in terms of cost for wills, like, obviously wills are costly, and, like, for people who are worrying about struggling to afford a will, I think, again, I would recommend looking at the gendered intelligence stuff. It's all in the article, but there's a guide by gendered intelligence that lays out those findings. I think it also puts in that guide, like, some places that you can get a low cost will, or I think there's, like, a week each year where a bunch of people will kind of, who would generally charge, like, a lot of money to write wills, will offer up their services for free for a week, for people
Oh wow.
who, yeah, for people who are worried about being able to afford, like, kind
Mm,
of the legal side of it. So, like, I would definitely recommend having a look into that. I'm waiting for later this year to have a look at what services are on offer as well. And I never would have known that that was a thing before. So, like, yeah, I guess on top of everything, that's another thing to add to, like, what needs to change, is, like, resource sharing. And us, like, once
totally.
we start having this conversation, we can then start being like, well, these are the things that are already available, and
Hmm.
this is what we're going to create next.
Yeah. Wow. That's such a good tip. Yeah. Amazing. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so. It's just been really, yeah, it's, thank you for giving me
Mm,
the space to, like, talk about this. And it's been really eye opening for me writing this piece. And it definitely makes me want to talk, even though it's difficult, want to talk more to the people in my life. I mean, trans and non-binary and otherwise, about death and what they want, and making sure that we're giving people as much as we can within the current restrictions of not being able to put your actual gender on your death certificate, but being able to give everything we can around that.
That's amazing. Yes. I will definitely make sure to put all the resources on the podcast page.
Oh, amazing.
So, yeah, let's spread the word. Thank you so much for talking to me about all this.
No, thank you. I know as well, death is it's quite grim. So yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the space.
I suppose it is. It's like, the thing is, I don't have difficulty talking about it as such, but I know I'm probably more of an exception than anything else, to be fair. So yeah. But it's good to address it, especially in a time where you might not think it's necessary, I suppose. So, because you never know in what situation you'll be grateful that you did, totally. Yeah. You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/YAS, which is YAS, where you can also read the transcript, and you can find YAS on their website, yasnecati.co.uk, and on Twitter at YAS NECATI. Free Wills Month is actually this month, March 2021, and it's for over 55s. Visit freewillsmonth.org.uk to find out more. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com and on social media. If you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Plans start from only $1 a month. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender for more details. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open-minded. Oh, thanks again for chatting to me.
Oh, thank you.
Time for a nap.
Yeah, time for the midday nap.
With cats. Yes.